Hi, everybody. Hope you're doing well tonight. I think I'm doing very well. Hi, Margot. Hi, Dale. Hi, Bonnie. Hi, Russ. How are you tonight? It's nice to see you all. And hi, Dolores. Good to see you too. And hi, Devora. I know you were here for at least a minute because I saw your share. And Mark Collins. I don't know if you're here yet, but I saw your share. If you are. Okay, nice to see you all. So tonight's discussion is going to be about Senator Warren's Rethinking Public Safety Plan, which she published on the Medium website. She posted it there rather than only posting a link to it on her website. Anyway, I wanted to go through this with you and then, in broad terms anyway, compare it to Bernie's. If you recall, Bernie's plan, which I went over last week, was called Justice and Safety for All. And Elizabeth Warren's plan is called Rethinking Public Safety to Reduce Mass Incarceration and Strengthen Communities. And just as Bernie Sanders' plan was a very, very good one, quite impressive. Turns out, that Elizabeth Warren's plan is also quite impressive. And now I'm going to share the screen so you can see that one, as well as see me in the corner. I hope my sound is all right. I'm going to take a moment to check on that and then come back to this screen. Okay, I presume my sound is all right because I'm not getting any complaints from everyone or from anyone. Actually. Okay, so I assume it's all right. So I'm going back to the page I need to be on right now. Yes, we are back there again. Okay, so Warren starts off with some of the generalities, of course. That we as a nation make up 5% of the world's population. Please excuse the plane that is passing overhead right now. But nearly 20% of the prison population of the world. And she points out we have the highest rate of incarceration in the world, with over 2 million people in prison and jail. And she says our system is the result of dozens of choices we've made, and these choices together stack the deck against the poor and the disadvantaged. And she says, simply put, we have criminalized too many things. We send too many people to jail. We keep them there for too long. We do little to rehabilitate them. We spend billions propping up an entire industry that profits from mass incorporation. And we do all of this despite a little evidence that our harshly punitive system makes our communities safer. and knowing that a majority of people currently in prison will eventually return to our communities and our neighborhoods. And to make matters worse, the evidence is clear there are structural race problems in this system. Um, okay. Our Latinx adults are 3 times more likely to be incarcerated than whites for the exact same crimes. Black Americans are more likely than whites to be arrested, charged, wrongfully convicted, and given harsher sentences. 1 in 10 black children has an incarcerated parent. Warren says 4 words are etched above the Supreme Court: equal justice under law. She says that's supposed to be the promise of our justice system, but today in America, there's one system for the rich and powerful and another one, okay, for everybody else. It's not equal justice when a kid with an ounce of pot can get thrown in jail while a bank executive who launders money for a drug cartel can get a bonus. It's long past time for us to reform our system. And she says, real reform requires examining every step of this system, from what we choose to criminalize, to how law enforcement and prosecutors engage with communities and the accused, to how long we keep people behind bars, how we treat them when they're there, and how we integrate them when they return. We cannot achieve this by nibbling around the edges. We need to tackle the problem at its roots. That means we have to implement a set of bold structural changes at all levels of government, and it starts by reimagining how we talk and think about public safety. For example, and then she has some bullet points, and those are important because they sort of scope out what she's thinking about. She says public safety should mean providing every opportunity for all our kids to get a good education and stay in school. So already she's signaling public safety is much more than putting people in jail, or to achieve it, we must do far more than quit putting people in jail, or far more, for example, than simply putting people in jail. Second bullet point, it should mean safe, affordable housing that keeps families together and off the streets. So, a pretty social outlook on this. It should mean violence intervention programs that divert young people from criminal activity before the police become involved. And she says it should mean policies that recognize the humanity of trans people and other LGBTQ plus Americans and keep them safe from the violence. It should mean accessible mental health services and treatment for addiction. So that's how she scopes out the conceptual foundation of what she thinks will bring us public safety. So she says it's a false choice to suggest a trade-off between safety and mass incarceration. By spending our budgets not on imprisonment but on community services that lift people up, we'll decarcerate and make our communities safer. Here's my plan. First, she wants to rethink our approach to public safety. She says it's not a matter of simply reforming our sentencing guidelines or improving the relations of the police to the community. We need to rethink our approach to public safety, transitioning it away from a punitive system and investing in evidence-based approaches that address the underlying drivers of violence and crime, tackling it at its roots before it ever has a chance to grow. Now, in saying this, she is citing a general approach, okay, to criminal justice which has been the kind of approach that has been advocated by left of center people for as long as I'm able to remember. The idea of tackling law breaking and public safety and crime at the roots of these phenomena. In other words, tackling the basic causes of things rather than simply the symptoms of things, has been an approach that has been debated since the 1950s, probably before that. But even when people were talking about civil strife and civil violence during the latter part of the 1960s and the early part of the 1970s, there was, of course, the approach of dealing with the symptoms, um, 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 simply having a lot of public safety personnel, specifically police, and getting more and more and more police, and trying to crush the social deviance and get rid of it by jailing people and taking them out of society. In other words, the coercive approach. And then there's been, the alternative approach of getting at the causes of violence and crime and trying to get rid of it by tackling it at its roots, as she says, before it has a chance, to grow. So this is not a new approach to crime and public safety. I was advocating for it myself back in the 1960s when I first got out of school. In other words, when I completed a PhD, I was studying social conflicts and how to integrate our political systems. And as a student of conflict, and how to resolve it, I was all about getting at the causes of conflict first to understand it, in order then to apply the remedies that would be able to minimize it. So I've been looking at approaches like this now for 60 years. So she says, break the school to prison pipeline. Schools increasingly rely on police officers to carry out discipline while neglecting services that are critical to the well-being of students. She says at least 14 million students attend schools with a police officer, but without a single counselor, social worker, psychologist, or nurse. When I went to school back in the 1940s and 1950s, before I went to college, and I went to public schools, we didn't have any police officers in the schools. We did have counselors. We did not have at that time school psychologists, but we had nurses on the spot in the New York City school system. Counselors and nurses. It's no surprise that tens of thousands of students are arrested annually, many for minor infractions. Zero tolerance policies. Thank you, Rudy Giuliani. Zero tolerance policies start early. On average, 250 preschoolers are suspended or expelled every day. To be fair, I shouldn't only be thanking Rudy Giuliani, I should be thanking Bill Clinton and Joe Biden as well, who were at this very seriously in the 1990s. And I guess Hillary Clinton should be thrown in there too. But anyway, zero tolerance policies start early. On average, 250 preschoolers are suspended or expelled every day. And even in the youngest years, students of color bear the brunt. In later grades, says Warren, black and brown students are disproportionately arrested in schools, while students with disabilities face an increased risk of disciplinary uh, action. And she goes on, every child should have the opportunity to receive the support they need to thrive inside and outside of the classroom. And then adverse childhood experiences such as poverty, violence at home, homelessness, family separation, or an incarcerated caretaker are proven to negatively impact child development. And then she says, I will equip schools with resources to meet their students' needs by providing access to health care to support the physical, mental, and social development of children, improve their overall school readiness, and providing early intervention services. Well, I submit if she's to do that well, then she probably needs to continue to support the Medicare for All bill in the Senate, because that's the bill that's going to provide easy and free access to health care. So if she wants to do well with this, I think it kind of commits her to Medicare for All too. So she shouldn't be waffling on that at all. She has to keep that clearly in mind. Then she says we should decriminalize truancy and instead increase the number of school mental health personnel and provide schools with resources to train teachers and administrators in positive behavioral interventions, trauma informed alternative discipline practices, and implicit bias to limit suspensions, expulsions, okay, and also arrests for minor infractions. She says we should require that any police department receiving federal funds has to provide mandatory training in the scientific and psychological roots of discrimination, youth development, and de-escalation escalation tactics to officers assigned to school campuses. And she says, rescind Trump's I'll rescind Trump's executive order that allows school districts to participate in the 1033 program, giving them access to military grade weapons. And I'll fully fund the Office of Civil Rights of the Department of Education so that it can investigate school districts with the dramatic disparities in school disciplinary actions. Then she moves to a section entitled Reduce Homelessness and Housing Insecurity. By the way, did I miss the title of the previous section? Oh, yes, that was Break the School to Prison Pipeline. I think I did mention, okay, the title. And what I just read is how she proposes to do that. Next, she wants to reduce homelessness and housing insecurity. Children that experience homelessness are likely to drop out of school and more likely to become involved with the criminal system. But as housing and rental costs skyrocket and federal housing assistance doesn't keep pace, Housing insecurity is growing, particularly for families of color. And she says that her administration will commit federal funding to the goal of ending homelessness in our country. And she says, my housing plan will help by investing $500 billion over 10 years. That's $50 billion a year. That's a big piece of change to build, to preserve, and rehab affordable housing, creating 3.2 million new housing units and bringing down rental costs by 10%. It would also help families, especially families of color, to buy homes and start to build wealth. Substantially improving housing affordability isn't just good for the economy and for working families. It will also reduce homelessness and crime. Okay, that sounds great, and it's very good. And the 500 billion is a very sizable amount. Now, one might think that her commitment to affordable housing as a way to produce more security as a contributor to producing a more secure environment is something that is not actually repeated, in Bernie's plan. That this may be a big difference between the two plans. I don't think so. And the reason why I don't think so is this is the 500 billion is part of her housing plan. So she's referring to a separate housing plan, which is off to the side, to help to reduce homelessness and insecurity in housing. And Bernie, as part of his safety and justice plan, or perhaps it's justice and safety. I'm sorry. It is justice, and safety. He specifies there about $25 billion to invest specifically towards the problem, of homelessness. And then you think, just by reading the Justice and Safety Plan, that's the extent of it, and one might think, well, this doesn't compare to Warren's idea of investing 500 billion over 10 years. But you wouldn't be quite right, because what you have to do is to go to Bernie's Green New Deal plan. In his Green New Deal plan, he specifies that as part of the Green New Deal, 7.4 million new housing units will be created as part of the Green New Deal and will be targeted towards providing affordable housing for people. Now, Bernie doesn't cite a specific figure, but it's part of his 16.2 trillion Green New Deal plan. So Bernie also intends to spend a huge amount of money in creating affordable housing, and more than twice the number of units that Warren is planning for here. Anyway, I wanted to clarify that. Our next area is invest in evidence-based interruption programs. So what are they? To improve safety in our communities, we also need to invest in programs that are going to prevent violence and divert criminal behavior. And she says that models in cities like Boston, Oakland, and Chicago demonstrate that we can successfully reduce homicide and gun violence rates through creating cross-community partnerships and focused deterrence on the small percentage of people most likely to commit violence. And I'm not sure quite what she means here, except that different communities would be collaborating, would be identifying people who are likely to commit violence and who and that would make these people subject to deterrent activities on the part of not simply the authorities, but also social workers and psychologists, okay, and other people who would be focused on actually diverting these people to other activities that are more socially friendly. Then she says these programs are cost effective and have actual multiplier effects, transforming community climate, improving health outcomes, and boosting local economies. And she says her administration will invest in piloting similar programs, that is, like the programs in Boston, Oakland, and Chicago, um, that she's going to invest in piloting such programs at scale. In other words, at a large scale in many, many cities. And so that's what she's going to do in terms of starting what she calls evidence-based interruption programs. Next, she's going to decriminalize mental health crises. And here she points to something that was also extensively discussed in Bernie's plan. Okay, she says the solution for someone experiencing a mental health crisis should not be a badge and a gun, but it should be police officers. Okay, and she says we now have a situation where police officers have become America's de facto first providers when it comes to mental health. And she says historically, 7 to 10% of police encounters involve a person affected by mental illness. And people with untreated severe mental illness are 16 times more likely to be killed during a police encounter than other people are. And she says people with mental illnesses are not incarcerated at higher rates because they are prone to violence. To the contrary, most are arrested for nonviolent offenses. Okay, many because they lack access to necessary services. But incarcerating people with mental illness is more expensive than actually providing appropriate community-based treatment. Instead of shuttling people into a system that's not built to meet their needs, we should invest in stopping people from reaching those crisis points in the first place. And she says here, okay, that Medicare for All will provide continuous access to critical mental health care services, decreasing the likelihood that the police will be called as a matter of last resort. So here, she herself is making the connection between Medicare for All and her her public safety plan. So if she intends to implement her public safety plan, if she's serious about that, she's got to remain serious about her Medicare for All plan as well. Now, some people have said they've seen signs of her flip-flopping on that, or maybe getting ready to flip-flop on that over the last 2 or 3 weeks. So I think that we ought to continue to remind her that her support for the Medicare for All bill is intimately connected to her support for her public safety plan. And she cannot give up the Medicare for All bill without also undermining her public safety plan. So she has to keep that in mind. She then goes on to say, I'll also increase funding for co-responder initiatives that connect law enforcement to mental health care providers and experts, and my administration will pilot evidence-based crisis response efforts to provide needed services to individuals struggling with mental illness. What does she mean, okay, by evidence-based here? She keeps using the term evidence-based. I think what she means is what the findings of the social sciences have shown based on empirical studies. In other words, not based on common sense, not based on theory, but based on theory, tested by evidence-based crisis response policies and evidence-based studies. Next, she wants to invest in divergent programs for substance abuse disorder. And she says people who struggle with addiction should not be incarcerated because of their disease. Now, of course, in Europe, they've known that for many, many, many years. Denmark, okay, and the Netherlands are famous for not incarcerating people because of this. Okay, in England also, this has been the case for some time, and in other countries, okay, as well. It's only we in America who, since the 1960s, have failed to learn this particular lesson, that addicts should not be incarcerated. And she says, okay, that mass incarceration has not reduced addiction rates or deaths due to overdoses, because substance abuse disorder is a public health problem, and it's long past time to treat it that way. Yes, 60 years past time. We know that diversion programs are both more humane and a better investment than incarceration. And then she puts a dollar value on it. She says, for every dollar we invest in treatment programs, we can save $12 in future crime and healthcare costs. I don't know where she's gotten that from, but I assume it's from a set of evidence-based studies. She says, I'll support evidence-based safe injection sites and okay, and also needle exchanges, and expand the availability of the drug buprenorphine to prevent overdoses. This, by the way, is saying the same thing as Bernie's plan when he is in this particular context. Okay, Warren says, and my CARE Act would invest $100 billion over 10 years to increase access to high quality treatment and support services. I don't recall Bernie's plan citing a number like that. it may be cast actually within a larger category, which also has a big number. I know he was investing a lot, though, in this kind, okay, of care, and I think that plans are of similar scale, okay, with respect to this. Okay, but anyway, this is good. It's a heavy investment in increasing access to high quality treatment and support services. And she says it would provide the regions most affected by the opioid crisis with the resources they need and would allow state, local, and tribal governments to use CARE Act funds to provide incarcerated individuals and individuals in pre-trial detention with substance use disorder to get the treatment they need. Next, she wants to change what we choose to criminalize. She's already said that we face an overcriminalization crisis. It's filled our prisons and devastated entire neighborhoods. She wants to start reform by rethinking what we choose to criminalize. She says it's easy for legislators fearful of being labeled soft on crime to rubber stamp every new criminal and sentencing proposal, no matter how punitive it is. She says it's equal easy for them to look the other way when the wealthy and the well connected abuse the rest of us. But from the Senate on down, uh, uh, but from the Senate on down, the lawmakers have an obligation to do better than that. And then she says, here's where we can start. And under that heading, the first section is repeal the 1994 crime bill. That is the bill that Joe Biden and Bill Clinton were so instrumental in passing. And she says the 1994 crime bill exacerbated incarceration rates in this country, punishing people more severely for even minor infractions and limiting discretion in charging and sentencing in our judicial system. That punitive, tough on crime approach was wrong. It was a mistake. It needs to be repealed. There are some sections of law, like those that are relating to domestic violence, that should be retained, but the bulk of the law must go. Very direct speaking. And I'm afraid that it applies to what Kamala Harris as well. You know, chameleon. It does apply to her as well because she certainly zealously enforced the 1994 crime bill when she was in California. Anyway, Warren's next segment says that she wants to address the legacy of the war on drugs. She says for 4 decades, we've subscribed to a war on drugs theory of crime, which has criminalized addiction, has ripped apart families, and largely failed to curb drug use. This failure has been particularly harmful for communities of color, and we need a new approach. It starts with legalizing with it starts with legalizing marijuana and erasing past convictions, okay, and then eliminating the remaining disparity between crack and powder cocaine sentencing. And rather than incarcerating individuals with substance abuse disorders, We should expand options that divert them into programs that provide real treatment. Of course, I entirely agree with that, and Bernie does too. And also, he's in support, okay, of legalizing marijuana as well. So, next she says, stop criminalizing homelessness. Housing provides safety and stability, but too many experience homelessness. To make matters worse, many cities have criminalized homelessness by banning behavior associated with it, like sleeping in public, okay, or living in a vehicle. These laws draw people into the justice system instead of giving them access to the services they need. They disproportionately impact communities of color, LGBTQ plus people, and people with disabilities, all of whom experience higher rates of homelessness. And she says, rather than treating the homeless like criminals, we should get them with the resources they need to get back on their feet. Then she says, stop criminalizing poverty. And then a simple misdemeanor like a speeding ticket shouldn't be enough to send someone to spiraling into poverty or worse, but often the fines and fees that are levied by our legal system bury low income people who are able to pay under uh, court related debt with no way out. She says, we abolished debt as prisons nearly 200 years ago, but we're still criminalizing poverty in this country. Low income individuals are more likely to find themselves entangled in the system and less likely to find their way out. She says, there is no justification for imposing unreasonably high burdens on those who are least able to bear them. She said, as president, I will fight to end a cash bail. And then she has a paragraph, okay, on that. She wants to allow people to return to their jobs and families while they wait for trial. And she wants to put people in detention only for those cases that pose a true flight or safety risk. And of course, the same thing is in Bernie's justice reform plan as well. And she wants to restrict fines and fees that are levied before adjudication. In many jurisdictions, individuals are charged cost prohibitive pre-trial fees, sending them into debt even if they are ultimately acquitted of a crime. And then she says, in cases of pre-trial civil forfeiture, an individual often is not able to recover property seized before they're convicted. And she says, I'll reverse the Trump administration's policy expanding pre-trial civil forfeiture at the federal level and restrict the use of civil forfeiture in general. That statement is good, but it's a little less strong than Bernie's similar statement, where he basically says that he wants to get rid of civil forfeiture. I think he's, if I recall correctly, that he pretty much said that without any qualification. I think that's one area in which his criminal justice plan is superior to Warren's. And then she says, I want to cap the assessment of fines and fees. She says, jailing someone who can't afford to pay thousands of dollars in fines, okay, on an hourly minimum wage salary is not only cruel, okay, it's ineffective. And she says that the criminal debt collection should be capped at a percentage of income for low income people. States should also eliminate the profit incentive that drives excessive fees and fines by capping the percentage of the municipal by revenues derived from the justice system and diverting seized assets into a general fund. So when she's talking seized assets here, she seems to still be talking about maybe retaining civil asset by forfeiture to a degree. That seems a little unclear. She could be referring to that, or maybe she's only referring to the assets that are seized from fees. Anyway, she wants to eliminate fees for necessary services. She points out private companies and contractors can charge incarcerated people for essential services like phone calls, bank transfers, and health care. She points out private companies also profit from charging individuals for their own incarceration and supervision, including through fees for reentry, supervision, and for probation. She says, as I detailed in my plan to end private prisons, I will end this practice and ensure that private companies don't get rich from exploiting vulnerable people. And then she refers you to a separate plan to end private prisons. And she is very explicit in her plan. She wants to get rid of the private companies in the prison system, certainly at the federal level, and she wants to, in various ways, provide incentives for local communities to get rid of them as well. So I think she is very serious about that. I don't think she's quite as emphatic about it, okay, as Bernie is. Okay, I think that Bernie would actually make it so difficult for private prisons in his reform that they simply will not be able to operate. I'm not sure Liz's plan is quite so strong. But I think Kate approaches that. I think she's good on the private prisons issue. She doesn't like private prisons, for sure. She's going to stop them from charging fees for necessary services. Next, she wants to have accountability for the wealthy and the well-connected. She talks about equal justice, which means an end to the impunity enjoyed by those with money and power. She says instead of criminalizing poverty and expanding mass incarceration, I've proposed a new criminal negligence standard for executives of corporations with more than $1 billion in annual revenue when their company is found guilty of a crime or their negligence causes severe harm to American families. Instead of locking up people for non-violent types, of marijuana crimes, I've proposed putting pharmaceutical executives on the hook to report suspicious orders for controlled substances that damage the lives, of millions. And she says, I've proposed new certification requirements for the executives at giant financial institutions so that we can hold them criminally accountable if the banks they oversee commit fraud. Next, she wants reforms on how the law is enforced, and she says We have to critically examine each aspect of the enforcement process to ensure that it is both just and consistent with public safety. And then she talks about law enforcement reform. She starts by complimenting the police, okay, of course, saying they work tirelessly and take risks every day to keep us safe. And she says, but we also know that many people of color, including Native Americans, disproportionately experience trauma at the hands of law enforcement, sometimes with life-altering consequences. She says, on average, 3 people are shot and killed by the police every day. A disproportionate number of them are young and black. Okay, and others are arrested and enter into a system that unduly penalizes even minor infractions. She says that everyone is less safe when trust erodes between the police and the communities they serve. Yet we've continued to allow policing practices that are both ineffective and discriminatory. It's time, she says, to fundamentally change how police work is done in America, funding what works, replacing failed policies with ineffective, evidence based practices that do not violate individual rights, and reframing our approach to public safety but to prioritize actual prevention over punishment. Here's how we do it, she says. Our first bullet point: improve access to treatment and to early intervention. And she says she'll invest in mental and emotional health support to help our officers do their job, including by expanding promising pilots like peer intervention and early warning programs for our police. She wants to improve the data collection and reporting. And she says, for nearly a century, we have measured crime in this country. And then she says, it's time we measure justice and act when we fail to measure up. She wants a database on fatal police shootings, on ethics issues, on misconduct complaints, or use of force incidents. She says her Justice Department will establish a rigorous and systematic process to collect this data to provide data collection training to law enforcement, okay, that is relevant, and make data publicly available wherever possible. So she wants transparency in this. And she says we'll use that data to prioritize federal oversight and to hold police accountable for the portion of the bad outcomes for which they are responsible. And will work with interested departments, she says, to use their own data to improve their legitimacy in the communities they serve and inform more just and effective more just and effective policing. Next, she wants to increase the federal oversight the capacity. And she talks about the Obama Justice Department trying to do that, but having resource constraints, and the Trump administration not initiating any investigations at all. She says she's going to reverse the policies of Jeff Sessions, which limited the use of consent decree investigations. Okay, this is an element of Bernie's plan as well. And she's going to triple funding for the Office of Civil Rights to allow for increased investigations of departments with the highest rates of violence by the police. And whenever there is a death in custody, she's going to investigate. She says, in this way, we can further incentivize our police departments with persistent issues to adopt best practices. She wants to empower the state attorneys general because she knows the DOJ will not be able to provide oversight for the many thousands of law enforcement agencies in the country. So she wants to incentivize the states to empower their attorneys general to conduct their own oversight of police behavior nationwide. She wants to demand increased civilian oversight. She wants community engagement to fill the gap and provide oversight where the federal government, even with increased capacity, cannot. She says 150 communities have civilian boards overseeing the police, but says that covers only a small percentage of law enforcement agencies in America. She wants to expand that and expand also the democratic engagement in policing. She says she will implement a competitive grant program that provides fundings to communities and establish an independent civilian oversight mechanism for their police departments, such as a civilian oversight board or office of civilian complaints. She says these boards should have a role in officer discipline and provide input on hiring hiring police executives as well as hiring, and but also promoting within the departments that they oversee. So civilians are going to have a say in who gets promoted and who gets hired in the departments. That would be a revolution for Baltimore, I'll tell you that. She wants to establish a federal standard for the use of force. She's going to direct her administration, to develop and apply evidence-based standards for the use of force for federal law enforcement, incorporating proven approaches and strategies like de-escalation and verbal warning requirements, and the use of non-lethal non-lethal means of actually policing. At the federal level, she says, prohibit the pursuit policies we have now that often result in collateral damage, like high-speed chases and shooting at vehicles that are moving. And I'll work with local law enforcement agencies to ensure the training and technology deployed at the federal level can be implemented at all levels of government, helping to limit the use of force while maintaining safety for officers in the communities they're sworn to protect. She's going to increase federal funding for the training of law enforcement, and she's going to direct that at reducing police-involved shootings and improving the perceptions of the legitimacy of the police in the communities. She wants to provide incentives for cities and states that hire a diverse police force and to provide tools and resources to ensure that best practices on law enforcement training are available across America. And she wants to provide the local police with what they need to meet federal training requirements, including training on implicit bias and the scientific and psychological roots of discrimination, cultural competency, and engaging individuals with cognitive, or other disabilities. And she says we should support evidence-based continuing education for officers throughout their careers. She wants to restrict the use of qualified immunity in order to hold the police officers accountable. She says when an officer abuses the law, that's bad for law enforcement, bad for victims, and bad for communities. And she says that those who violate someone's constitutional rights today are typically shielded from civil rights types of lawsuits, but through the use of qualified immunity. And she says it's a legal rule invented by the courts that blocks lawsuits against government officials for misconduct unless a court has previously decided the same conduct in the same context was unconstitutional. And she points out that this practice of qualified immunity has shielded misconduct of police from accountability and drawn criticism from across the political spectrum. And she gives some very striking examples, which I'm not going to go through here. Suffice it to say that she supports actually limiting qualified immunity for law enforcement officials who are found to have violated the Constitution. And she supports also allowing victims to sue police departments directly for negligently hiring officers despite prior misconduct. That's something she seems to be very serious about as well. She wants to end the racially discriminatory policing that we have now. She wants to end things like stop and frisk. She wants to end trampling the constitutional rights of countless Americans. She wants to end the broken windows policing policies. And she says she'll work with Congress to pass laws to prohibit profiling at all levels of law enforcement. And she wants to separate law enforcement from immigration enforcement. She says the data are clear. When local law enforcement is mixed with immigration enforcement, immigrants are less likely to report crimes and public safety suffers. She says it's time to stop directing law enforcement officers to do things that undermine their ability to keep their communities safe. And she says her plan, for immigration will address this by ending the 287G and Secure Communities programs, putting in guidelines to protect sensitive locations like hospitals and schools, and expanding protections for immigrant survivors of violent crimes that come forward and work with law enforcement. She wants to demilitarize also local law enforcement, get rid of the 1033 program, which was the program for transferring these military grade weapons and lethal equipment to local police forces. She wants to prohibit local law enforcement from buying any military equipment with federal funding. And she wants to create a buyback program for equipment already in use in our communities. She wants to expand the responsible use, of body cams, and at the same time protect the privacy, of citizens. She wants to expand the funding for the body cams, and she wants to make them available to even small communities. But she wants to establish a task force, on digital privacy in public safeties to establish guardrails, she calls them, and appropriate um, 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 actual protections of privacy for this and other surveillance technology, including the use of facial recognition technology and algorithms that exacerbate the underlying bias, of the police. And she says, I'll make it clear that individuals have every right to record an interaction with the police. So presumably she's going to put that into law, essentially codifying the right for people to use their own cameras when they are interacting with the police. In most cases, that would be the cameras on their phones. She wants to reduce gun violence. She wants gun reform. That's common sense gun reform. She points out in 2013, almost 40,000 people died from guns in the United States. That's almost the same number of people that died from lack of health insurance in the United States. She says, I have a plan with the goal of reducing that number, by 80%. That's good, but that still means that something like 7,500 people would die from gun violence in the United States. That's probably still too many. She wants to reduce the numbers by expanding background checks, establishing a federal licensing system, and holding the gun industry accountable for the violence that is actually promoted by their products. She wants to go through judicial reform and prosecutorial reform. And here she has some bullet points as well. She wants to strengthen public defenders and expand access to counsel. And she talks about various ways of doing this and says that she's going to provide funding for it, expand targeted grant funding for public defenders at the state level to ensure they have the tools to effectively defend their clients. She's going to try to balance resources on the prosecutorial side with the resources which the defense will be able to call on. She's going to reopen and expand the DOJ's Office for Access to Justice, which worked with state and local governments to expand access to counsel. She wants to rein in the prosecutorial abuses. She wants to reduce the use of the plea bargaining, of a coercive type by DOJ prosecutors at the federal level. She wants to establish open file discovery, so the defense can easily see what the prosecutors have. And she wants to put in place responsible standards for evidence gathering. And she wants to establish a commission on prosecutorial conduct to make additional recommendations for best practices, and to monitor adoption of the recommendations. And she's going to have an independent prosecutorial integrity unit to hold accountable prosecutors who abuse their power. Next, she wants to expand justice for people who are wrongfully imprisoned. And she talks about reinstating the right of habeas corpus, which has been severely restricted over a number of decades now in the United States. And she says this is really particularly important for Black Americans, okay, and for Native Americans. And she says that actually for Black Americans, they make up only 13% of the population, but a plurality of wrongful convictions. In 1996, at the height of harsh federal penalties that drove mass incarceration, Congress made it absurdly difficult for wrongfully imprisoned individuals to bring these cases in federal court. She says since then, conservative Supreme Court justices have built on those restrictions, making it nearly impossible for defendants to receive habeas relief, even when they have actual proof of innocence. She says we should repeal these overly restrictive rules for habeas corpus actions, making it harder for courts to dismiss these claims on procedural technicalities and make it easier to apply new rules that emerge from these cases to people who were wrongfully imprisoned before those rules came into effect. So that seems to be, she's very much for restorative justice. She wants to protect also the rights of survivors. She says crime victims have the right to safety and justice, the right to be consulted and informed about the status of the case, and the right to be treated with dignity and respect. We should provide support for those who have experienced trauma, including medical care and safe housing. This is particularly true for those who have experienced sexual assault or violence at the hands of a partner. I'll also fight to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act and provide full funding to eliminate the rape kit, the backlog that exists across the country. So, if she's elected, no more rape kit backlog. That's interesting. That's not something that's mentioned by Bernie Sanders in his plan. Actually, most of the rest of this is. But that is something that could use an explicit statement. We really need that to be done across the country. It's an outrage that such a backlog exists. She wants to appoint a judicial bench that is diverse. She says flat out, judicial appointments are mostly white and male. And large numbers tend to have a prosecutorial background. She says diversity of experience matters. That's why I have pushed for increasing the professional diversity of our federal judiciary to insulate the courts from corporate capture. Very important on this. And why I support gender and racial diversity for judicial nominees. And she says, I'll appoint a diverse slate of judges, including those who have a background defending civil liberties or as public uh, uh, defenders. Okay, so that's in some form, in Bernie's reform, but also most of what I've been going through now is also, okay, in Bernie's program. Where it's not in Bernie's program, I've tried to indicate that. Next, he wants to take into account the views of those most impacted by the system. It says, as president, I will establish an advisory board comprised of survivors of violence, along with formerly incarcerated individuals. I'll consult with this advisory board and listen to the needs of those who have firsthand experience with the system as we find fair and just solutions to the challenges we face. This is similar to some things that Bernie has in his bill, but not actually exactly the same. She's sort of implying here that this will be a very high level advisory board. I suppose, okay, an advisory board to the Attorney General. Uh, I didn't see that, okay, in Bernie's plan. He would have advisory boards comprised of survivors, okay, violence at actually community levels, okay, throughout the country. And both of them, though, are emphasizing civilian community participation in the law enforcement process, okay, is very important. Next, she wants to reform incarceration. She wants to reduce the mandatory minimums and truth in sentencing provisions that uh, currently require offenders to serve the heavy majority of their sentences because these requirements have not proven effective. Which Congress should reduce or eliminate these provisions, giving justice more flexibility in sentencing decisions with the goal of reducing incarceration to mid 1990s levels. That's an explicit goal. Uh, while Sanders is advocating things, okay, in the same direction, and seems to be even more forceful in wanting to get rid of the mandatory minimums. His plan doesn't come up with the goal of actually reducing incarceration to the same levels uh, as existed at the time of the passage of the crime bill. Of course, he may be aiming for something still lower, but I'm just saying there's no explicit goal there. Anyway, he says his administration will also reverse the Sessions memo that requires uh, prosecutors at the federal level to seek the most severe possible penalties and allows the prosecutors the discretion to raise the charge standards for misdemeanors and seek shorter sentences for felony by convictions. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. He wants to allow the prosecutors to have discretion to raise the charge standards actually for a misdemeanor and to seek shorter sentences for a felony conviction. She wants to raise the age for criminal liability. She says we know cognition and also decision making skills continue to develop later than the teenage years. For that reason, many states have raised the age, okay, of criminal liability to at least 17, or granted additional discretion to prosecutors when charging offenders between the ages of 16, okay, and 18. She said the federal government should do the same. She wants to eliminate life with no parole sentences for minors, and she wants to divert the young adult offenders into programs, okay, that are rehabilitative wherever possible. She wants to end the capital punishment. Also, Bernie wants to end it in his plan, okay, as well. She wants to use the pardon and clemency powers very broadly to right systemic injustices. And says she'll remove the clemency process from the DOJ. Instead, she's going to empower a clemency board to recommend the clemency and pardon actions directly to the White House. It says, I'll direct the board to identify broad classes of potentially deserving individuals for review, including those who would have benefited under who would have benefited from retroactivity under the First Step Act, individuals who were jailed under outdated or discriminatory drug laws, or those who are serving uh, serving some kind of mandatory minimum that should be abolished. So she really wants to let a lot of people who don't belong in jail out. She also wants to improve conditions, in prisons, ensure incarceration meets very basic kinds of human rights standards. I won't go through that, in detail, but obviously it's very, very good that she wants to do that. She wants to protect the vulnerable populations, like pregnant women, victims of domestic violence, people who have a disability, LGBTQ plus individuals who often require special protections while they're in prison. And she's going to implement an auditing program to ensure prisons are adhering to legal requirements to protect the LGBTQ plus individuals and others from sexual violence and assault while incarcerated. And she's going to prosecute prison staff who engage in violations, or misconduct here. She'll ensure that juveniles are not housed in adult prisons. She's also going to eliminate the use of solitary confinement for protective purposes. Instead, she'll direct the Bureau of Prisons to establish a set of standards and reforms to protect the most vulnerable in our prison in a way that does not involve confining a person for more than 20 hours a day, as is the case now. Okay, there are a few more bullet points here. I'm not going to go, through all of them. I want to emphasize once more that she definitely wants to eliminate the private prisons entirely. She wants to support as well, the reentry of people, providing them, with job opportunities and with various kinds of stabilization programs that will break the cycle of incarceration. Here, she would greatly benefit if she were also supporting a federal job guarantee, which she is not. That's going to be a big help for people who are coming out of prison to find opportunities to work at significant jobs at a living wage with good fringe benefits. She wants to ensure that, as best she can, that her reforms will also be extended to the state, and the local levels, of enforcement, and she'll use federal grants, which make up nearly 1/3 of state budgets. And I suppose also grants to local authorities, as well, to incentivize the state, and local governments to change, their criminal justice systems, to bring them in line with the federal system that she intends to establish. So that, is basically it. I think I can summarize it by saying that this is really an excellent program and compares very well with the Sanders program. If I had to say what's different, what I would say is that in spite of Warren's really very heavy emphasis on the social background of things and changing certain social conditions, that are breeding grounds for crime and for threats to public safety, and to justice. The Sanders plan, is even a little more broad than Warren's plan, because if you go back to the Sanders plan and you look at his segment on ensuring a just transition in the period after the release of people from jails, and from prisons. He's also very concerned, with the re-entry conditions, just as she is. But he seems to have even more support in certain areas than she has. I'm basically going through his plan here. Here's a segment on investing in community living that's a very broad plan and interacts with the Green New Deal plan. He has another segment on investing in our communities, and there he articulates relationship to his federal jobs guarantee plan and to passing to passing a minimum wage at $15 an hour. Also, his guarantee of health care under Medicare for all, in including mental health care. He would also provide transportation benefits to and from health services for those who need it. He's going to enact paid family leave. I think Warren is probably going to do that too under some other part, of her agenda. But Sanders also details these various related things that he's going to do, other parts, of his agenda that are going to help the re-entry process for people who are coming out of the prisons, the criminal justice system. So I would say, in that sense, that the emphasis that Bernie has on the deeper structural problems and the social conditions as basically breeding grounds for crime is even broader, than Warren's is. But I don't want to underestimate what she, is offering here. Her plan is very, very, very good. It is very impressive. And I think that she has something good to campaign on here. She seems to really want to tackle the problem at its roots. And so does Bernie. I think they both do, and they're comparable in that particular respect. What I've tried to do here is to point out some of the differences and to indicate in what ways I think the Bernie plan is better. So I'm now going to change my scene a bit here. There we go. And I'm also going to consider your comments. Okay, so Rob Rivera has joined. He says, hey Yoda. And Russ says, oops, where did you go? Video interrupted. And Russ says, there, you're back. I didn't realize, it was interrupted. It seemed to be steady, at my end. Steve Wolfbrand says, hi, Dr. Joe. And Bonnie came back in, and also, Devore is here, and Lana Dell is here, and Randy Hedgebeth is here. And Russ says, I've got to call it a night. See you again soon. Thanks, Russ. I'll be back, I believe, on Saturday night, at about 9 p.m. However, Devora is going to be arriving on Saturday morning. So I'm not entirely sure how Saturday, is going to go. But right now, until further notice, I do plan, another live stream, at 9 p.m. on Saturday night. There's much to discuss. All kinds of things, have been going on. Rob says, so far, what do you think of Warren's criminal justice proposal compared to Bernie's? I think it's a competitive proposal. She came out with hers first. I don't think it's quite as good, as Bernie's. I've already said why, but it's very, very good. She did a really good job here. I think that criminal justice, is an area of her strength, and the justice system, in general. After all, but she was but she has been has actually been a law professor. Lana asks, what will you be discussing on Saturday? I don't know. It will be between what has been going on politically with respect to the polls and the progress that people are making in the race. But currently, I'll probably be talking some about the commentary, uh, but I'm also very motivated to talk about what's been happening to the climate emergency. There are lots of things that are going on there, and that's a very important area to talk about. So I haven't really decided what I'm going to emphasize on Saturday night, but at this point, it looks like it'll be in one of those two areas. There's just so much going on now in terms of the politics, uh, and so I'm very tempted to talk about that, but I'm also very tempted to talk about the climate. Okay, while I still have a few of you here, I still do have a few of you here. I'm going to flash my share, like, and subscribe. In my Patreon screen. Very briefly. And now I'll come back to my basic screen and see if you have any more comments or questions. Steve says, gotta go. Oh, he says, Steve says, I don't trust Warren to do what she proposes. I trust her to want to do what she proposes in the criminal justice area. I just don't know if she can manage the politics sufficiently well to do it. I don't think she's going to have the movement behind her that Bernie would have in back of him. I also don't think that even if she does have a movement in back of her and becomes president, partly as a result of that movement, I don't know if she's going to follow through and keep the movement alive and in her corner while she tries to pass her agenda. That is so vital and so important in passing her agenda. It seems to me Bernie is trying to create a revolution in our policies, but a revolution in our politics too, in how politics is done, and that he wants to return to the mass basis of politics that we had for much of the 1930s, and even to extend that further, to make it a regular part of our politics going forward. So, in that sense, I think he really wants to democratize our system in a more fundamental way than Warren does. And I think that that will result in her having less power to pass on her agenda. Now, I don't think that she's going to kabuki us as much, okay, as the recent presidents have. I do think she'll try to enact the criminal justice agenda that she's put forward. I do think she's going to try to rein in the banks, okay, and Wall Street. I do think she's going to try to clean up the government from a classical early 20th century perspective. Okay. In other words, she's going to be a La Follette style progressive. Okay, in the Midwestern tradition, I think she will stand up to the corporations, even though it might cost her some donors. But she's not going to revolutionize America. She's not going to convert a considerable portion of the economy into a democratic socialist form, as I think, okay, that Bernie would. Instead, she's going to try to convert it into a responsible public purpose form, okay, of capitalism. I trust her to try to do that. So I trust her to improve things. I don't really trust her, though, to save our lives. What saving our lives is about is getting those climate emergency goals fulfilled. And I don't think she's going to have the mass movement behind her, which is going to allow her to do that. I think the only one who can mobilize the mass movement for that purpose at this time is Bernie Sanders. Now, once he gets that ball rolling for 4 years, okay, or for 8 years, if he's able to last, okay, for 8 years, then that system will be on its track. And then, if she should succeed him as the president, or if someone else like Tulsi, okay, or Ocasio-Cortez should succeed him, okay, as president, they will probably go on extending his policies in accord with the momentum that he created. But I think that for now, I think she would fail, okay, at implementing the Green New Deal, which is going to save us. And for that reason, okay, I think the only choice that realistically right now can save us, the only presidential choice that has a chance of saving us right now, okay, is Bernie Sanders. I've said that, okay, on a number of occasions, okay, and I believe it. And I'll keep on making that argument. It isn't even just a matter of the personal will okay, of the two people. It isn't even a matter of how much they're motivated by goodwill and how much by a mixture of considerations, including goodwill. I think it's a matter of capability. Now, people are focusing on electability, always talking about, okay, electability. Biden is more electable than Sanders, okay, and Biden is more, okay, or less electable than Sanders and Warren, okay, and some of the others, okay, and Bernie is, is less electable, okay, than Warren. Well, I think that those assessments are all wrong. I think that Bernie is the most electable candidate. But we have not only to ask who is the most electable candidate, we also have to ask who is the most survivable candidate. Who is the most survivable candidate? Which candidate might have the presidency that will most likely allow us to survive? And I think that person is Bernie Sanders, hands down. Hiya, Mark. How you doing? It's good to see you here. I noticed you shared the video earlier. Okay. Any other comments or questions before I say goodnight? So thank you for being here. Okay, as of now, I expect to see you again on Saturday, okay, at 9 o'clock. Please share, like, and subscribe. And check in at my Patreon account if you would. I'd appreciate it.